The year is 1929. At the Osaka Army Arsenal, Japanese engineers are preparing to unveil what they believe will be the foundation of their armored warfare doctrine for decades to come. The Type 89 medium tank, designated I-Go, rolls out of the factory with ceremony and pride. It represents everything the Imperial Japanese Army thinks it understands about modern warfare. Within 15 years, that tank, once celebrated as a triumph of Japanese military engineering, would become a steel coffin for the men ordered to crew it. But the tragedy of the Type 89 isn't just that it became obsolete. The tragedy is that it was designed with assumptions so fundamentally flawed that it was obsolete before the first production model ever fired a shot in anger. This is the story of a tank that was outdated on arrival, the ideology that created it, and what happens when military doctrine is built on pride rather than reality. To understand how Japan created a tank that was doomed from the beginning, you first need to understand what Japanese military planners believed about warfare in the 1920s. They believed tanks were primarily infantry support weapons, meant to crawl forward at walking pace alongside foot soldiers, crushing barbed wire and suppressing machine gun nests. They believed future wars would be fought like the last war, in the mud and trenches of the Western Front, where speed mattered less than the ability to cross broken ground. They believed Japan's likely enemies, primarily China and the Soviet Union, would field infantry-heavy armies with limited anti-tank capabilities. Most critically, they believed they had time to refine the design, time to build manufacturing capacity, time to develop doctrine. Every single one of those beliefs was wrong. The Type 89 specifications tell the story of a military establishment designing for a war that had already ended. The tank weighed 12.7 tons, powered by a 120-horsepower Mitsubishi air-cooled diesel engine that could push it to a maximum speed of 25 kilometers per hour on roads. On rough terrain, the speed dropped to a crawling 15 kilometers per hour. The armor, 17 millimeters at its thickest point, was designed to stop rifle fire and shrapnel, nothing more. The main gun, a short-barreled 57 millimeter Type 90, was intended to fire high explosive shells at infantry positions and fortifications, not to duel with other tanks. Two 6.5 millimeter machine guns, one in the hull and one rear-facing, completed the armament. On paper, for the war Japanese planners imagined, it was adequate. The problem was that the war they imagined bore no resemblance to the war that was coming. The first Type 89s entered service in 1931, just in time for the invasion of Manchuria. In those early campaigns against poorly equipped Chinese forces with virtually no anti-tank weapons, the Type 89 performed exactly as intended. It rumbled forward at infantry pace, its armor shrugging off small arms fire, its 57 millimeter gun demolishing fortified positions. Japanese tankers wrote reports praising the design. Commanders cited its success in combat. The tank was declared a victory of Japanese engineering. But what looked like success was actually the most dangerous thing that can happen to a military: validation of flawed assumptions. The Type 89 worked in Manchuria not because it was a good design, but because it faced an enemy even more poorly equipped than itself. The Imperial Japanese Army learned exactly the wrong lesson. While Japan celebrated the Type 89's performance in China, the rest of the world was racing ahead. In the Soviet Union, designers were creating the BT series, fast tanks capable of 50 kilometers per hour with sloped armor and 45 millimeter high-velocity guns. In Germany, even as the Treaty of Versailles officially banned tank development, engineers were secretly designing the Panzer III and I-4, vehicles that would redefine armored warfare. In Britain, the Matilda II was entering production with armor thick enough to bounce anti-tank rounds. In America, industrial capacity was being quietly prepared to mass-produce armor on a scale Japan couldn't imagine. The global standard for what a tank should be was evolving rapidly. The Type 89 was standing still. By 1935, perceptive officers in the Imperial Japanese Army were starting to understand they had a problem. Reports from military observers in Europe described tanks that were faster, better armed, and more heavily armored than anything in Japanese service. Intelligence from the Soviet Far East revealed that Japan's most likely major opponent was fielding armor in quantities and quality that dwarfed Japanese capabilities. Requests were made for a new tank design, something modern that could face these new threats. But here's where the second failure compounded the first: institutional inertia. The Type 89 production lines were already built. Factories were tooled for its manufacture. Crews were trained on its systems. Doctrine was written around its capabilities. To admit the Type 89 was inadequate meant admitting that years of investment and planning had been wasted. So instead of radical change, Japan chose incremental improvement. A slightly more powerful engine here, marginally thicker armor there, a new model designated Type 89B that was really just the same obsolete design with minor modifications. The fundamental flaws remained untouched. The Nomonhan incident in 1939 should have been the wake-up call that shattered every comfortable assumption. Japanese forces, including Type 89 tanks, clashed with Soviet and Mongolian forces along the Manchurian border in what became a full-scale, though undeclared war. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks, along with heavier T-26 models, tore through Japanese armor. The Type 89s, designed to face infantry, found themselves in tank-versus-tank combat they were never meant to fight. Soviet 45mm guns punched through 17mm of Japanese armor at ranges where the Type 89's short-barreled 57mm couldn't even effectively return fire. Speed that seemed adequate in China became a death sentence when trying to maneuver against tanks twice as fast. Japanese tankers watched their rounds bounce off Soviet armor while enemy shells turned their vehicles into burning metal tombs. The casualty reports were devastating. Japan lost the battle decisively, and the Type 89's inadequacy was exposed in the most brutal way possible in the lives of the men who crewed them. After Nomonhan, you might expect urgent reform, a crash program to replace the obsolete Type 89 with something modern. Instead, the response revealed the third and perhaps most fatal flaw in Japanese military thinking: the inability to admit systemic failure. Official reports blamed tactics, not technology. They blamed crew training, not fundamental design obsolescence. They blamed everything except the core truth that the Type 89 was fighting a 1940s war with a 1920s tank. Yes, new designs like the Type 97 Chiha were introduced, but they were evolutionary, not revolutionary, still rooted in the same infantry support doctrine that had created the Type 89. More critically, the Type 89 remained in frontline service. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to replace its existing armor fleet, so tanks that had proven inadequate against Soviet forces in 1939 would be expected to fight American forces in 1941. The men ordered to crew them were being sent into battle in vehicles their superiors knew were obsolete. December 1941. The Pacific War begins, and Type 89 tanks roll into combat across Southeast Asia. In the early campaigns against British, Dutch, and American forces caught unprepared and undersupplied, the Type 89s again seem effective. They support infantry advances through Malaya, crash through defensive positions in the Philippines, rumble into Singapore alongside Japanese troops. But this is Manchuria again, success against weaker opposition masking fundamental inadequacy. The Type 89 isn't winning because it's good. It's winning because Japanese infantry tactics are superior, because Allied forces are retreating in disarray, because the speed of the Japanese advance overwhelms defensive preparations. The tank itself is just along for the ride. But unlike China in the 1930s, the Allies aren't going to stay weak. They're going to get stronger, much stronger, while Japan's armor remains frozen in 1929. By 1943, the mask is coming off. American forces, now equipped with M4 Sherman tanks, are beginning their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. The Sherman, with its 75mm gun, sloped frontal armor up to 50mm thick, and top speed of 40 kilometers per hour, is everything the Type 89 is not: modern, powerful, produced in vast quantities. When Type 89s encounter Shermans, the result isn't combat, it's execution. American tankers report engagements where their 75mm guns penetrate Type 89 armor at ranges beyond a kilometer, while Japanese return fire bounces harmlessly off Sherman hulls. The speed differential means Type 89s can't maneuver, can't flank, can't escape. They can only sit and die. Japanese tank crews are brave, often fanatically so, but bravery can't overcome the physics of a 57mm shell failing to penetrate armor it was never designed to defeat. The human cost of obsolescence is written in the after-action reports from places like Tarawa, Saipan, and the Philippines. Type 89 crews, knowing their vehicles are outmatched, employ desperate tactics. They hide tanks in prepared positions, hoping to ambush Shermans at point-blank range, where even their inadequate guns might penetrate. They use their tanks as static pillboxes, buried in the ground with only the turret exposed, sacrificing all mobility in exchange for a few extra millimeters of protection from the earth itself. They conduct suicidal charges, trying to close distance before Sherman guns tear them apart, hoping to ram or use explosive charges if their ammunition proves useless. These aren't tactics born of doctrine. They're improvisations born of desperation, the actions of men ordered to fight in weapons platforms that should never have been sent into combat. Here's what that looked like on an individual level. Imagine you're a Type 89 crew member on Saipan in June 1944. You're 23 years old, trained on a tank that your instructors told you was the finest armor Japan could produce. You've been taught that Japanese spirit can overcome material disadvantages, that courage and determination matter more than steel thickness and gun caliber. You believe, because you have to believe, that your training and fighting spirit will be enough. Then the Americans land, and you see the Shermans rolling off the landing craft. You watch as they shrug off hits from your 57mm gun. You see your rounds, when they hit, leave nothing but scratches on American armor. You watch other Type 89s brew up from Sherman fire at ranges where you can't even effectively shoot back. The radio chatter is panicked voices, screams cut short, then silence as another tank stops transmitting. Your commander orders you forward because retreat isn't an option, because Japanese doctrine doesn't permit withdrawal, because the island must be defended even though everyone in your tank knows you're driving toward death in a vehicle that was obsolete before you were born. The psychological weight of fighting in obsolete equipment is something military histories often skip past in favor of tactical analysis, but it's crucial to understanding what happened to Japanese tank crews. These men weren't stupid. They could see the technological gap. They understood, after the first few engagements, that they were outmatched. But the military system they served in offered no outlet for that knowledge. You couldn't report that your tank was inadequate. That was defeatist thinking. You couldn't request better equipment. Japan didn't have better equipment to give, and suggesting the lack was a criticism of leadership. You couldn't even discuss the disparity honestly with your fellow crew members without risking morale or accusations of cowardice. So you internalized the fear, climbed into your obsolete tank day after day, and tried to convince yourself that fighting spirit would somehow overcome the difference between 17 millimeters of armor and 50, between a low-velocity 57mm and a high-velocity 75. You had to believe the lie because acknowledging the truth meant acknowledging you were already dead. The Type 89's obsolescence wasn't just a technical failure. It was a systemic revelation of how the entire Japanese military-industrial complex approached modern warfare. Japan in the 1920s and 30s was trying to be a first-rate military power with a second-rate industrial base. The country lacked the steel production, the manufacturing capacity, the resource access, and the technological infrastructure that total mechanized war required. German industry could produce thousands of panzers. Soviet industry could churn out T-34s in quantities that absorbed staggering losses and kept fighting. American industry could build Shermans so fast they were practically disposable, lost by the hundreds, and replaced within weeks. Japan couldn't do any of that. Japanese industry in 1941 produced roughly the same number of tanks that Germany produced in a single month. Every tank lost was a significant percentage of total available armor. There was no reserve of modern vehicles waiting to replace losses. The Type 89 stayed in service not because Japanese commanders thought it was adequate, but because there was nothing else. This is where we need to slow down and understand something about institutional self-deception. By 1943, everyone in the Japanese military hierarchy knew that Type 89 was obsolete. Intelligence reports spelled it out. Combat after-action reports confirmed it. Officers who had faced Soviet armor at Nomonhan tried to communicate it. But the system couldn't process that information productively because processing it meant confronting a larger, more devastating truth. Japan couldn't win a material war against industrialized opponents. The obsolescence of the Type 89 wasn't just an equipment problem that could be solved with a new design. It was evidence of strategic impossibility. So instead of confronting that reality, the military establishment did what institutions often do when facing uncomfortable truth. They changed the story. The Type 89 wasn't obsolete, commanders claimed. It was simply being used for purposes beyond its intended role. Losses weren't due to technical inadequacy. They were the result of crew errors, tactical mistakes, or insufficient fighting spirit. The problem wasn't the tank. The problem was never the tank. This pattern of denial extended all the way up the command structure. When younger officers submitted reports detailing the Type 89's failures and requesting modern armor, they were often reprimanded for defeatism. When crews requested modifications or tactical changes to mitigate their vehicle's weaknesses, they were told to fight harder and trust in Japanese superiority. The very act of acknowledging obsolescence became seen as a failure of spirit rather than a recognition of reality. This created a perverse feedback loop where the people with the most direct knowledge of the Type 89's inadequacy, the crews who fought in it, had the least ability to make their knowledge matter. Meanwhile, the people making strategic decisions, senior commanders, far from the front, could maintain comfortable fictions unchallenged by first-hand experience. The Type 89 kept being deployed because the system that deployed it couldn't admit it had failed. By 1945, the Type 89 medium tank's story reaches its grim conclusion. After years of fighting, the few surviving examples are scattered across Pacific islands, most buried as static emplacements or disabled by American fire. Some have been abandoned, their crews dead or scattered. A handful remain in the Japanese home islands, held in reserve for the final defense that never comes. When the war ends, the Type 89's legacy is written in melted armor and casualty lists, in the graves of men who fought in vehicles that should never have been sent into modern combat. But the real legacy isn't in the metal, it's in what the Type 89 reveals about designing for the wrong war, about institutional inability to adapt, about the human cost when pride trumps reality. Here's what makes the Type 89 story particularly haunting. It wasn't a surprise failure. It wasn't a promising design that unexpectedly didn't work. It was a predictable disaster that happened in slow motion over 15 years, while people who knew better watched. In 1929, when the Type 89 was designed, military observers could already see that armor technology was advancing rapidly. By 1931, when it entered service, European and Soviet tanks were already surpassing it. By 1935, the gap was obvious to anyone paying attention. By 1939, no man proved it catastrophically. Yet in 1941, the Type 89 was still being deployed to fight a major war, and in 1945, examples were still in service. That's not a failure of prediction. That's a failure of institutional courage, the inability to say that the emperor has no clothes, that the treasured weapon is obsolete, that continuing down the current path leads to disaster. Think about what this meant for the individual tanker. You join the armored forces believing you're entering an elite branch of the military, trained on sophisticated weapons that give you advantage in combat. You're taught that your Type 89 is the product of Japanese engineering excellence, that its design reflects superior understanding of armored warfare. Then you encounter reality, your first engagement with a Sherman or a Soviet T-34 or even a late-model British tank, and suddenly everything you've been taught collides with physics. Your rounds don't penetrate. Their rounds cut through your armor like paper. Your top speed is a crawl compared to their maneuverability. Every technical advantage you were promised doesn't exist. You're not in an elite unit with superior equipment. You're in a metal coffin with a gun that can't kill and armor that can't protect. And there's no one you can tell, no system in place to report that reality up the chain, no possibility of change. You just climb back in the next day and try not to think about it. The deeper you look at the Type 89 story, the more it becomes clear that the tank itself is almost beside the point. Yes, it was obsolete. Yes, its design was based on flawed assumptions about future warfare. Yes, Japanese tankers paid for those flaws with their lives. But the Type 89 could have been replaced. New designs existed. The Type 97 Chiha was better. The Type 3 Chi-Nu, developed late in the war, was actually somewhat competitive with Allied armor. Japan had talented designers who understood modern armor requirements. The problem wasn't technical knowledge. The problem was a military system that valued continuity over adaptation, that treated admission of error as weakness rather than wisdom, that confused maintaining course with strength and changing course with defeat. The Type 89 stayed in service because replacing it would have required admitting that the planning and doctrine and industrial investment of the previous decade had been based on fundamental misunderstandings of modern war. That admission never came. There's a particular kind of tragedy when soldiers die not from unexpected failure, but from predictable consequences of known inadequacy. When the Type 89 burned in the Pacific, it wasn't because of some unforeseen weakness, some hidden flaw that only revealed itself in combat. It was because the tank was doing exactly what it was designed to do in a war that bore no resemblance to the conflict it was designed for. Every loss was preventable, not in the sense that better tactics could have saved individual crews, but in the sense that the entire strategic framework that put those crews in those tanks in that war was built on a foundation of denial. The men who died in Type 89s weren't victims of enemy superiority. They were victims of their own military establishment's inability to confront reality. By the end of the Pacific War, Japan had lost approximately 90% of its armor forces, thousands of tankers dead, thousands more wounded or captured. The majority of those casualties occurred in tanks that were obsolete by any modern standard, the Type 89 prominent among them. In post-war analysis, military historians would catalog the technical deficiencies, the armor thickness and gun penetration calculations that told the story in cold numbers. But those numbers represent human beings who climbed into vehicles they knew were inadequate, followed orders they knew were based on false assumptions, fought battles they understood were unwinnable with the equipment provided, and died when reality exceeded the armor and firepower their obsolete tanks could provide. The tragedy of the Type 89 isn't that it failed. The tragedy is that its failure was engineered into it from the beginning, and no one with the power to change that reality had the courage to do so. In the final accounting, the Type 89 medium tank serves as a monument to a particular kind of military failure, not the failure of equipment, which can happen to any nation in any war, not the failure of courage, which Japanese tankers demonstrated again and again, but the failure of intellectual honesty, the inability of a military institution to confront its own errors, to admit when assumptions prove false, to change course when reality diverges from planning. The Type 89 was obsolete before the war began because the system that created it valued validation of existing beliefs over adaptation to new reality. That's not a uniquely Japanese failure. Every military in history has struggled with it. But the Type 89 is a particularly stark example because the gap between what was needed and what was provided was so vast, the consequences so deadly, and the institutional denial so complete. When you visit military museums today, you can sometimes find preserved Type 89 tanks, their armor still bearing the scars of combat, their cramped interiors silent testimony to the men who crewed them. Stand next to one and you're struck by how small it is, how thin the armor looks, how limited the visibility would have been. Then imagine climbing inside, knowing that somewhere ahead is a Sherman or a T-34, knowing your gun probably won't penetrate their armor, knowing their gun will certainly penetrate yours. Imagine the smell of diesel and sweat and fear in the cramped interior. Imagine the radio crackling with reports of other tanks burning. Imagine your commander ordering you forward anyway because retreat isn't an option, because the mission requires it, because the Emperor demands it. Imagine doing that day after day, island after island, knowing you're in an obsolete machine but having no choice but to fight as if faith could overcome physics. That's the human reality the statistics and technical specifications represent. The story of the Type 89 isn't really about tanks. It's about what happens when ideology insulates itself from reality, when institutions prize the appearance of strength over the admission of weakness, when the people who make decisions are shielded from the consequences of those decisions. It's about the gap between what leaders believe and what frontline soldiers experience, between official doctrine and battlefield truth. It's about men caught between courage and futility, ordered to fight in equipment they know is obsolete by commanders who can't acknowledge that obsolescence. Most of all, it's about the human cost of institutional self-deception, counted in burning tanks and dead crewmen and battles lost, not because the enemy was too strong, but because your own side couldn't face reality. The Type 89 was obsolete before the war began. But here's the deeper truth. Everyone involved knew it. The designers knew it, or should have known it, if they were paying attention to global developments. The commanders knew it after Nomonhan proved it. The tankers knew it the moment they encountered modern Allied armor. The institutional leadership knew it, but couldn't admit it without confronting systemic failure. The tragedy isn't that Japan built an obsolete tank. Every nation has built failed weapons. The tragedy is that Japan kept deploying that obsolete tank, kept sending men into combat in vehicles everyone knew were inadequate, kept maintaining the fiction of adequacy long after reality had exposed it as fantasy. And the men in those tanks, the ones who paid with their lives for their superiors' inability to confront uncomfortable truth, they knew it most of all. They knew, and they climbed in anyway because courage persists even when hope dies. That's what makes their sacrifice not heroic but tragic. They deserved better than the Type 89. They deserved a military establishment that valued truth over pride. They deserved leaders who would admit error rather than spend lives maintaining comfortable lies. They deserved a fighting chance. Instead, they got a tank that was obsolete before the war even began.